Dear Revelation scholars, this is now the second part to our examination of the theology of the book of Revelation, specifically the nature of God and how Revelation presents us God, the primary character that we talked about in the opening of Revelation chapter 1. Of course, we are looking far beyond chapter 1. We've already explored chapter 1 and seen some of the names and attributes that are attributed to God and the Trinitarian concept that we find right in the opening of the book of Revelation. But now we'll move on into some of the later chapters, particularly the apocalyptic section now, in which God is presented on the throne. So this is the final section where we're going to talk about the fourth characteristic and the fourth name of God, namely the one who sits on the throne. This is a quite popular theme, and it's used, surprise, surprise, 7 times. As you have noticed, the reference to 7 is not just visible in the very clear allusions, such as the series of 7, the 7 churches, the 7 seals, the 7 trumpets, the 7 bowls, and so on and so on. There's very clear imagery, but you can see that even in the subtlety, John has preserved the value of 7. We have noticed the reference to 7 in the previous references to God, and now we see it again. 7 times Revelation speaks of God as the one who sits on the throne. We find that and here's a list of the 7 references. Chapter 4 verse 9, chapter 5 verse 1, chapter 5 verse 7 and 13, chapter 6 verse 16, 7:15, and chapter 21 verse 5. There are some variations to this exact expression. We find that in chapter 4, in verses 2 and 3, there's a slight difference in wording. Also in chapter 7 verse 10, 19 verse 4, and 20 verse 11, there's allusions to the idea, the concept of God as the one who sits on the throne without using that exact phrase. Obviously, the center reference to this passage and to this phrase is in the throne room scene that is aptly called the throne room scene in chapters 4 and 5. Here God is presented on the throne throughout these 2 chapters, and 2 chapters are just dedicated to this throne room scene. This is an Old Testament concept. We already find it in Isaiah chapter 6. We see it in Ezekiel chapter 1, and we even get a brief glimpse of that in the heavenly scene in Daniel chapter 7 at the center of the vision that Daniel has received. God is sovereign, and he is in heaven. That is supposed to give comfort to the believers. God is in control. God has universal rule. Despite everything being so chaotic on earth, and all the turmoil that is affected and that believers are in, and that we heard about in the previous chapter, chapters 2 and 3 highlight some of the turmoils, some of them very, very real. There are people groups that are being mentioned that the church is struggling with and doesn't know how to cope with, especially influences of some pagan nature, or some people that have ulterior motives, that don't have the best interest at heart for the church. And so the church, in a variety of places, is in real turmoil. And now, in the midst of all this turmoil, there's not just the reassurance of the one who overcomes, and then a promise that Jesus gives at the end of each of those 7 churches. And there's not just the promise of Jesus at the beginning of each of the 7 churches, that he will be with them in a variety of descriptions. But here in chapter 4 and 5, something radical happens, and it's actually a look back. It's a backwards look. The chapter 4 and 5 are presenting the big enthronement scene of Jesus Christ, as we find in Dr. Ranko Stefanovich's Revelation dissertation. in his dissertation that he originally wrote, and you can find it in many other works and commentaries as well. John is talking about the enthronement of Jesus, and that is an event that John sees as being something that happens with the ascension of Jesus. And so this is a glance backwards into history. We're we're decades past the ascension of Jesus and the inauguration of Jesus. Again, here this prophetic or even apocalyptic vision is actually a vision into the past about something that has already happened. Jesus is enthroned. But it begins, Jesus will not be fully introduced till chapter 5. The throne room scene is opened with chapter 4. God is sovereign in heaven. Despite everything that's happening on earth, God is sovereign. He is the universal ruler, and that includes earth. And this is the big concept that will remain until chapter 21 through 22. Things originate out of heaven. Even the difficult and hard to understand aspects will have a heavenly and cosmic dimension to them. Many of the most traumatic concepts and scenes in Revelation will come directly from the throne room of God. It is God who is ultimately in control despite things being awry on earth. Richard Bauckham has made this statement, and it resonates with me, and so I want to share that with you. On earth, the powers of evil challenge God's rule, and even masquerade as the ultimate power over all things, claiming divinity. Bauckham is specifically referring to chapter 13, which we'll get to later. But heaven is the sphere of the ultimate reality. What is true in heaven must become true on earth. God is sovereign, and that sovereignty will play out and will become the reality on earth. In the meantime, there is a masquerading, there is a fake reality, and that will have to be replaced. These throne room scenes are popular in the Old Testament and even in the apocalyptic literature. I already mentioned Isaiah chapter 6 and Ezekiel chapter 1 as being a glimpse of this. Daniel chapter 7 and 9 and 10 we already also mentioned, but you'll also find them in 1 Enoch 14, 1 Enoch chapter 60, chapter 71 in 1 Enoch, and 2 Enoch chapter 20, and so on. And actually, we read a passage from 2 Enoch 20 when I introduced you to the genre of apocalyptic literature, and that was part of this throne room scene that is in Enoch's apocalyptic literature, or attributed to Enoch in this pseudepigrapha. Revelation has many similarities to these other apocalyptic writings. They're monotheistic, they refer to one God who is in control. There's no focus on a physical description of God. God is not described in detail, nor is it the point of any of those writings, but God is demonstrated to be in all his glory in this heavenly throne room scene, and usually there's an element of judgment along with this, or of judging an individual. But there's also a key difference. Revelation takes a complete new perspective and adds this to the throne room scene, and that is a Christian perspective, a Christ follower perspective, one in which Christ will play a major feature. That is the big difference. We have the closest parallel to that is actually in Daniel chapter 7, where we have the Son of Man that at the end of the chapter appears and is victorious. Now we have this in the form of Jesus is worthy. And that is chapter 5. Jesus is worthy. And this is the big difference in the presentation of chapter 4. There are also some other creatures and other elements to this throne room scene. There are the living creatures that are present before the throne, and they seem to be a combination of Isaiah's seraphim in Isaiah chapter 6 verse 2 and Ezekiel's cherubim in Ezekiel chapter 1 verse 5 to 14. So a combination of these two, much like we see later on in chapter 13, that the beasts that we will see are a combination of the beast of Daniel chapter 7. So here we see that combination of features. It's a reminder of the cherubim on the mercy seat in Exodus 25, and introduces the idea of ceaseless worship. The center of everything is the glory of God, and everybody is here, including all of the creatures of the universe, to glorify God. And from this, it spreads from the four creatures, it spreads in ever larger circles to the angels, and at the end to all of creation. Worship is an important element of this throne room scene. But not only is worship a central theme, the whole idea of Revelation 4 and 5 is that there is a reality beyond what we see on earth. And this reality is God in His throne room. The reality that we face is only one dimension, and not the most important dimension, one that is about to change radically. The reality from God's perspective is very different. It's the behind-the-scenes view that is more important than the actual picture that you see. We, as human beings, only see to the sky and to the stars, but God looks down and has a completely different perspective. Already the Gospels have emphasized that Jesus just has a very different view of human beings, of one another, and of the reality around us, what is important and what is not important. But now we actually get that behind the view. The curtains are drawn and we see the real reality behind it. At least we get a small glimpse. And Revelation 4 and 5, and this picture of God on the throne, is supposed to show us that God is in control. This is the center of reality. This is where the reality does happen. We live in a warped reality, but the real reality is God's throne room. And what John is giving the believers in the churches, and ultimately us as well, is this view that we can trust that God will bring everything to a culmination and to a close, because the true reality is invisible to us at the moment. We do not see what is real. Our eyes see the reality around us, but that is not the true reality. What is true reality is this throne room scene. That is where we should derive our meaning and our sense of purpose and vision. The real reality. And if we were to know that real reality, we would glorify along with all the other creatures that are there. And in essence, we're already called to glorify God, to worship Him. Even though we have not fully seen it, we have to trust John's word of this true reality that is so far invisible to us. Surprisingly enough, this is also not a human-centered reality. Notice that humans play a minuscule part in this whole complex of worship. They are not at the beginning, they are not at the center, they're at the far end. This is a human-displaced view, meaning humans are pushed to the boundaries. First of all, this is a theocentric view of the world and the universe. It's a theocentric nature. Everything focuses together in God Himself. That is the view that is being presented. Not even amongst the group of worshippers are humans a central part. Instead, it all begins with the four creatures, and then it expands from there. Humans only come along the way. That leads us to the next group that is introduced in Revelation, all emphasizing who God is, all giving us more impact and insight into this heavenly reality. And that is the 24 elders that function as rulers. This is part of the heavenly council, something that we've already seen in Isaiah 24 and 23, or even in Daniel chapter 7 verse 9, where God presides over a heavenly council. This council is marked by crowns and thorns that indicate an element of rule, of power. And again, that feeds into this idea of God who is in control. Though God is not depicted with a crown, but all the subjects are, that it all feeds into this general concept of God is ultimately in control. He is not pictured, but we see all these other people responding to God. In fact, this is a wonderful narrative technique in which the emphasis is not placed to make a strong statement, is not to show the actual maybe person or action, but the reaction of somebody. Maybe you know this from Alfred Hitchcock movies or something of that nature. They were brilliant in describing and showing you very vividly a scene. And typical Alfred Hitchcock movie will, for example, not show an intruder that comes in with a knife to terrorize a home, but actually you will see how somebody is doing a mundane task. You don't even see anything, and then suddenly they are confronted with, there's an intruder in here, and the shock on their face is much more appealing than if you were to follow and see the intruder. So the result that you see in somebody's actions is much stronger than that if you were to portray that person. Even in the Gospels we see that. What makes the Gospel accounts of miracles so powerful is, and the individual that was healed or the group that was healed fell at his feet. Well, this image of response, that is a powerful image. And that's what we see here in Revelation chapter 4. The focus is on the response, and that gives us a much greater insight about who God is without actually portraying and describing him. It is that heavenly reality of crowns and political, of ruling, of authority, and yet God who is the sovereign. And the worship worship element becomes clear by removing themselves. These 24 elders remove themselves from the throne and cast their crowns down, ultimately showing both their ruling power but also their submission and their understanding of their placement before God. They worship God. It's an acknowledgement of human nature, of our limitation, of being created beings rather than creators ourselves. And it illustrates derivative power, meaning power that I do not have in myself, but that is awarded to me. And so I give recognition to that in that form of worship. And so Richard Bauckham aptly concludes, in the conflict of sovereignties, the lines are drawn between those who worship the beast and those who worship God. Here in chapter 4 and 5, we see the worship of God, and then in chapters 13 and 14, chapter 13, we begin to see worship of and the forced worship of the satanic trinity, those who worship the beast. Every stage, Bauckham continues, of God's victory through chapters 7 through 19 is accompanied by worship in heaven. The issue of true and false worship is fundamental to John's prophetic insight into the power structures of the world his readers lived in. The question of allegiance and of worship in the first century to the emperor or to God, or in the more cosmic dimension, worship to the beast and worship to God. That's what's at stake. And that is introduced, and all of that is centered in this theme of the one who sits on the throne. So when we get to chapter 14, where we see this call to worship, that must also be in the context of God who sits on the throne. This image is particularly strong in the apocalyptic section of Revelation, as it begins in chapter 4 all the way to the end of the book in chapter 21. This leads us to two conclusions of this throne room scene as it relates to God, and two important aspects that this scene introduces about God. Number one, divine holiness and judgment, and point number two, God the Creator. These are two aspects that are encompassed in this, the one who sits on the throne. Two things must come out of that. Two things we must understand with this image of God who sits on the throne, the one who sits on the throne. Let me expand on the first one, divine holiness and judgment, particularly divine holiness in judgment. Chapter 4 has been categorized as the ultimate reality. This is the ultimate reality, absolute holiness, righteousness, and sovereignty of God, all combined into one. The holiness and righteousness of God require the condemnation of unrighteousness. The two must go hand in hand. As one stands, the other cannot continue to exist. And so what is on earth, namely righteousness, what is in heaven, righteousness and holiness, is contrasted with the unrighteousness that is on earth, and ultimately the destruction that comes and is initiated from the throne. It is God's rule that will ultimately end unrighteousness. And therefore we have three series of judgment: the seven seals, the seven trumpets, and the seven bowls. These three sets of seven. And that shows the complete judgment, the completeness of God's judgment on the unrighteous world. It's not a partial, it is complete, and that means it is finished. Even in that, there is good news. Judgment comes from the throne. It will be complete in all aspects. It will not be unfinished. It is like taking out a cancer and removing all of it, not just part of it. You make sure that nothing is left. This begins that journey. From chapter 4 we begin that journey of judgment that wasn't there before, and that's that apocalyptic element of the vision and that defines the apocalyptic nature of this book. Judgment emanates from the throne. First, it is the four living beings that call for the four horses in the opening of the seven seals, and then it is seven angels before God that blow the seven trumpets, and then we have this image of the temple and the heavens opening, and from the temple angels leave, and that is the seven bowls. All of the judgment that happens comes from this throne room scene. Nothing is excluded from it. This is where it all begins, and that's why John spends 2 chapters on this opening of the scene as we enter that apocalyptic part of the book. The allusions in chapter 4 begin right from the beginning. The chapter 4 is that beginning scene for the allusions, and it leads right into a temple scene that we see in 15 verse 8. The temple was filled with smoke, and similarly we have smoke here. This refers to Isaiah chapter 6 verse 4, where you similarly have the same throne room scene, and the temple, the house is filled with smoke. Chapter 4 verse 8 has this holy, 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 the Lord God Almighty, this reference to God the Almighty. And we have that same wording in Isaiah chapter 6 verse 3, where the angels also proclaim holy, holy, holy. Chapter 4 verse 5 is a reference, the seventh in series, to the flashes of lightning and thunderstorm. This is a combination of Ezekiel chapter 1:13 and the Exodus event, where at Sinai we have this flashing of light and thunderstorm in Exodus 19 verse 16. So we have flashes and lightning. We find that again in chapter 8 verse 5, in chapter 11:19 again, and chapter 16. There's a progressive expansion and intensification as we move from chapter 4 through the rest of the scenes in Revelation. So this is the beginning point that we need to understand, and it is all centered in God's nature. This is the first conclusion: God and his divine judgment. From here on, everything else comes into play. All the series that come from here emanate out of this throne room scene at the very beginning of this apocalyptic section. That's why it's so important, and that's why this cut is so clear. But there's a second element that comes right out of this understanding as well, and that is God is the creator. And that almost seems an antithesis to the previous, because the judgment that we will see throughout Revelation sounds very much like destruction, and indeed it is. There is an element of destruction that follows the seals, the trumpets, and the bowls, and the plagues. But there's also the idea of God the creator, and we already see that in chapter 4. Of course we anticipated at the end of Revelation chapter 21 and 22, but here we already have it in the wording of the 24 elders. They say, "For you created all things, and by your will they existed and were created," in verse 11. Here is ultimate power. The creatures recognize that God is the ultimate creator, and they owe their own existence to God alone, and therefore he is worthy of worship. The worship is connected to being creature and creator, that relationship. In 14 verse 7, a passage very familiar to us: "Fear God and worship him who made heaven and earth and the sea and the springs of water." A clear reference to the creation of the world. And therefore, God the creator. Fear God, the one who created. Not just the one who sits on the throne, but because he is the one that sits on the throne, he is also the creator. In chapter 21 verse 5, God himself, in one of those two statements that God speaks himself directly to John, in this entire book, he says, "Behold, I make all things new." And that's of course a reference to Isaiah 65 verse 17. Only the Creator himself can recreate. So while he presents judgment, he also is the one who is the creator. Survival is the element. There will be survival, but not because of an evolution or progression, but because of a acceptance of who God who is, and a worship of God. It is not that our natural state will continually improve, or that we will achieve perfection, or that degradation of human beings will be removed. No, it is God who creates, God who sustains, and God who recreates. And God, the Creator, that has been a part of the journey so far. We get to experience now God as the sustainer, and the church is holding on to that promise of sustaining in the first century, in the difficult times, and in the times that we have today. And we all look forward to the last part of this, God who recreates. If he did the first two, he will do the last one. And that is why the book of Revelation ends so climactically in this new earth and heaven, this recreation. Now, even the Jewish apocalypses, the pseudepigrapha that we talked about, there was a hope not just for the recreation of an individual in terms of a resurrection of the dead, as we find, but it was a hope that God is going to renew all of creation. It was a hope for a new creation in total. And we find that in biblical texts, for example in 2 Peter chapter 3 verse 13 and onwards, and we even find it in Isaiah 65 verse 17, as we mentioned before. But we also find it in the writings of the pseudepigrapha, for example in 1 Enoch 72 and chapter 91 verse 16 in 1 Enoch. There is a hope that God will recreate. But now we do not just have a hope, we have God's promise, and we have a description of that reality. This is now a recognition of our humanity, God as the creator, and our hope and trust that God will recreate. And so here in chapter 4, the 24 elders already anticipate everything that is to come, namely the recreation that comes at the end of the book. God ultimately is the Alpha, the creator, and the Omega, the recreator. And Revelation now presents us that full scope in amazing beauty. And so that demonstrates God's faithfulness. We can trust that God is a covenant God that keeps to his promises, that is faithful to his people and to his chosen ones and the believers. And to illustrate that, Revelation 4 introduces God as the one who is portrayed with a rainbow around the throne. And this imagery in chapter 4 verse 3, right at the beginning of this chapter, is incredibly important. That is that element of sustaining. God has a rainbow around I am the one who can judge, as I did in the flood, but I'm also the one who sustains and keeps. I keep to my promises, and I keep to the promise that I will never send a flood again. Ezekiel 1 verse 28 has a similar image of the rainbow in God's throne. And then of course the flood narrative in Genesis chapter 6 verse 8. Here it is the sign of the covenant. Revelation is 11:18 says, God will destroy the destroyers of the earth. And that is an allusion to Genesis 6:11-13, where God destroys the corruptness on this earth. So again, the allusions to the flood event, but at the same time the sustaining power. God is the one who keeps to his promises, while others do not. So here in Revelation, God is portrayed as in this image of the one who sits on the throne. There's this powerful image of God's divine justice and his judgment and holiness and worship, but also the idea of God the Creator. And for both reasons, he should be worshipped. But ultimately it gives this hope to people and to all the believers that God is the one who created, who sustains, and who will recreate. And all these images, the rainbow, the creation language, the Sabbath language, the worship language, all contribute to this big picture that we see. And Revelation chapter 4 and 5 bring us that essential element and the prism through which we should understand all the following series of judgment, the series of the 7 seals and the 7 trumpets and the 7 bowls.